East River. And we run on all these ground. We own like 4 acres, basically, of our own land. 4.24 actually, if you're gonna be accurate. Yeah, slightly less than 5. But we started out by leasing my folks' place. And then we have 5 leases total in
Yep.
Paradise Valley.
Yep.
So we use our cows as a tool, and the beauty of this is like, I didn't know much about electric fence or, you know, kind of, I would say non-standard, standard infrastructure. But as you do this stuff, you get to learn, and I can talk about this for literally all day long. So I'll try to keep it limited, and please keep me on task. And lots of questions, feel free to interrupt me. If there's somebody online has a question, throw it in the chat. And if you bring it up for me, and I'll try not to speak too fast or too slow, but yeah, I get really excited about this, and Meagan is here to keep me on track and interject where needed.
I will interject.
Yeah.
I'd just like to say that Pete is definitely the brains of the operation. I'm mostly the labor. I don't look like I'm big, but I can lift heavy things and, yeah, keep them on track. So go for it.
And if
I'm
you can't
just
hear
gonna
me,
stop from the back.
if you can't hear me online, please raise your hand.
He's a mumbler.
Speak up. You can't read my lips, I know that. So if you throw up the PowerPoint, will hopefully keep me on track.
Oh, this one.
Yeah. So this is just titled grazing infrastructure, and the first part of this to me is context, which if we go to the next slide. And I don't know if you have to click through multiple ones.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, go back one. So, you know, when you're identifying or with grazing infrastructure, you gotta identify the situation you're in. You know, are you on a huge chunk of ground, you know, where land masses or land areas measured in sections versus acres or square feet? You know, what's the existing infrastructure? What type of, you know, are you on irrigated ground? We run on a lot of irrigated ground. You know, the appropriate grazing strategies, and we'll get into some grazing principles that are going to drive how you're going to design your system. The second part of this is understanding how to utilize geography to your advantage. If we get to the example we have at the end, I have kind of a case study for you. Christian's fairly familiar with that. Water considerations, access. Do I have anything else on the next slide? So, sorry, go back. Fencing, you know, there's perimeter fencing, there's internal fencing that's permanent, and then there's temporary fencing. And then capital in terms of the dollars and cents, what makes sense as far as investing in infrastructure versus owned versus leased. Like, we lease a lot of ground, so the way that we go about installing our infrastructure, I'll just cut to the chase with that, is anything that we install that we pay for, I can pluck out of the ground and leave with it. But there's a lot of labor that goes into installing pipelines, miles and miles of fence, etc. So there's that balance between using permanent fence versus temporary fence, you know, because every time you put a temporary fence in, you have the labor of putting it in and taking it down. Versus does it make sense to actually put a permanent fence in? Is that going to cash flow for you? And then the last part's just the nice to haves, need to haves. Like, what do you actually need to have to do this? Mostly I'm going to be talking about electric fence. Obviously built a ton of barbed wire fence and other fences in my life, but I am a huge fan of electric fence. I will never install another barbed wire fence unless somebody pays me to do it. And they pay for all the material. So next slide. So context. So season of use. We have some leases where there is no permanent, like, winterized water. So that limits us to, you know, sometime in the spring when it's warm enough to run water, and sometime in the fall before it freezes. So we try to vary the season of use with that. So how many months, days will it be stocked? Why do you need to know that? Yeah, like, how many cows are you gonna put there, or sheep? You know, I'm gonna talk mostly about cows. Our daughter Malloy runs sheep, so I have some examples of infrastructure about that. Do you need to stockpile that for winter use? We have a lot of ground that will graze during the summer, but the goal is also to stockpile that grass so we can feed our cows. So I don't know if any of you have bought hay lately or sell hay maybe, fairly expensive. So the more our cows can graze, the more money goes in our pockets. So that's a question you have to ask yourself. Go to the next slide. So own versus leased. You know, in some ways it's nice if you're working with people that you're leasing ground, because they're setting, you know, constraints. And as a landowner, it's a little bit easy to let some things slide. It's like, oh, I really want to do that. That's my goal, but it's really not that convenient right now. Well, when you have a lease with somebody, it holds you accountable. I mean, you can hold yourself accountable, but sometimes it's a little bit easier if somebody else does it for you. So again, what infrastructure do you own? Like I said, any permanent fence that's not exterior, I own internally, unless the landowners want to pay for it, and then it can stay. And any permanent fence I'm putting in is one strand of high tension wire, some wood posts, and some fiberglass or some sort of non-wood posts that are cheaper than wood posts. And then if there's an above ground pipeline, I own that, or we own that. Solar chargers, etc., energizers, you know, we own that. Portable corrals, chutes, whatever, we own that. But if the landowner is willing and wants to be able to utilize the different tools in the toolbox, then if they install like a tire tank or underground water system, I cannot take that out of the ground. Right, it's just cost prohibitive. Most of the expense in putting in that stuff is the excavation. So generally, if I can convince a landowner that, hey, you know, it makes sense if we could do a couple water developments, they finance it and they own it. So next slide or bullet. We talked about own versus leased. So grazing principle, and I think it's a whole nother slide. So like I said, this kind of drives your decisions on how you're going to do something. If you're only going to be at a place a certain time of year, every year, but maybe you have to defer grazing that the following year, depending on your situation, your context. But rest period is like the #1 thing when you're grazing. And I'm not going to go too deep into this because that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about infrastructure. And then stocking rate would be the next thing that drives whoever's running the cows or the sheep, that drives their profitability. The closer you can get your stocking rate to your carrying capacity. And the way I look at that is the goal for any grazer or person who's running livestock should be maximum sustainable profit per acre, right? And that encompasses the economic part of it, it encompasses the social part of it, and it definitely encompasses the environmental part of it, because if you're not sustainable, hopefully better than sustainable, you know, you can go in there and run 100 cows, but if it'll only run 100 cows for 1 year, and then next year it's down to 70, and next year down to 50, it's not sustainable. So stocking rate ideally is matched to carrying capacity. Go on to the next slide. So graze period. So utilizing the shortest graze period possible. So on our irrigated leases where it is convenient, we move the cows once a day, and we do it every single day of the year. Meagan loves it when it's 20 below. Let's go move the cows. Yeah, we do feed some hay and stuff like that, but in a situation where it doesn't take a lot of time to move the cows every single day, we'll lay out some poly wire, roll it up, let the cows in, move the water tank, and you know, come back the next day and do it again. You know, some people do it like 4 or 5 times a day. I don't have that capacity. I'm already pretty maxed out. But some of our other leases where we're grazing grass that isn't in the peak of its growing, when we graze it, it's not turning around and 3 days later throwing up, you know, significant growth. We'll move the cows every 3 to 7 days. Generally, I try to keep the cows moving every at least every 7 days, ideally every 3 days, and that has something to do with the rumen that I'm not gonna go into right now, because Meagan will kill me. Herd effect is basically using largest amount of animals possible. So what we do, and there's a lot of logic to doing that, right? So if you only have one herd to move, how many herds do you have to move in a day? One. So you won't have to spend the time that it takes to move that one herd versus if you have, you know, and sometimes it doesn't make sense. People can't put all 100 cows or 1,000 cows on one pasture, but if you can make your herds as big as possible and as few numbers, it's gonna save you on labor. It'll increase your ability to manage. So keeping that in mind as you're designing your infrastructure, it's particularly gonna come into play with water, because you have to design it for the maximum number of animals that you plan to have on that spot in any given day. So, you know, I'll get into it a little bit. We use a lot of 100 or 150 gallon tanks for over 100 head. But the distance they have to travel for water and how many cows go to water at once is way less than if you have 500 cows and they gotta go a half a mile or a mile of water. You're gonna have to have a lot more stored water or a lot higher recharge capacity on your tanks. And then stock density, I mean, that really comes down to bunching the animals together for a short period of time. The reason that's the lowest, you can achieve amazing results with that, but you can also have amazing wrecks with that if you don't know what you're doing. So that's why it's number 5. These grazing principles, I've gone through a bunch of different books and what have you. Give credit to Ranching for Profit for these. It's a pretty good course that I took years ago. But I think it really lines things out. So those are the 5 grading principles, and it's going to be driving some of our discussion. So next slide, geography. So what are some advantages to geography? Let's say instead of having a flat as a pancake Kansas, you know, 7-tower pivot.
No offense to Kansas, it's an amazing.
No, I love Kansas. I've been there twice in the last 2 years.
Shelter or windbreak.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah.
Drainage.
Drainage, yeah, you don't have to, you know, if you have a little bit of a slope, you're probably not gonna get serious pugging on your fields versus real flat. What else? Gravity. Gravity is by far your friend. Nutrient management, getting your cows high up on the ground, whether it's your water tanks or your mineral feeders, utilizing that to flow nutrients across the land. Aspect, you know, a south aspect, you're gonna be able to graze in a different time of year than a north aspect. And again, shelter, you know, there's a creek and there's trees and you can have cows on the north side or the south side, depending on what the situation is, or you can change where you're grazing time of day. So soil type, another one. You know, depending on the time of year, generally we don't have super wet springs where, you know, it's super muddy, but you know, if you have more gravelly soil type, you can save that for that time of year and design your infrastructure around that. And then again, season. We have a young man working for us this summer doing an internship, and he was asking me, he's like, well, what's it like? Well, we have a really short growing season, you know, it's 105, 110, maybe 120 days. I said, but the huge advantage we have in this area is that it freezes. And so, and I know that sounds weird, but you can run cows over the same frozen ground all winter long and not create compaction. So you can have one tank that'll cover maybe a square mile and they can walk that distance to that tank. So that's a huge advantage versus like if you're in Tennessee or somewhere where it gets 30, 40 beans, hurry up. So I won't elaborate too much. All right. Next slide, please. You hit on it, trees, shade, shelter, regeneration, the ease of building temporary fence versus permanent fence. You know, in some of these situations, if you're putting in temporary fence up and down hills, it's a lot easier just to do it once and do it permanent. So regeneration, I'll just give you a quick example of on the Jordan Ranch. That's where Barney Creek runs through. We've had a long static aspen trees that my dad fenced off the creek years and years ago. And they're just old and decadent. And I'm like, I'm gonna fence off the creek, but I'm gonna do it with electric wire. And then we're gonna run the cows through there once every 2 years. And as soon as I did that, you know, the aspen suckered and we have aspen going crazy. So As we're talking about riparian area and stuff, there are some strategies on grazing cows next to riparian areas. So moving on. Talk about nutrient management, gravity, key line contours. Meagan is gonna talk about a place that she just got back from in Australia about.
Key line contour. So in Australia, how many people have been to Australia? No one. Okay, when they talked drought, right, I know we talked about context, but I had no idea really what their drought meant, and pretty much everything turns to sand. So, and they've not only been through it once, several times, and they get over it, and then they're in it again. It's a nightmare. So anyway, met this gentleman named Martin Royds. If you don't know who he is, look him up. It's Royds. He's in New South Wales. He's in Braidwood. He's done amazing things with contours, and leaky weirs. He follows a gentleman by the name of Peter Andrews, but what's interesting is that he's done so much work in these areas, and I'm not gonna go too much into it, but look him up. He is now supplying water because of the work he's done with these things. The Shoal River, which supplies water to the city of Sydney, it's hard to say together. And what's amazing, again, is that he'll do these contours along, and then they look like massive ditches when he starts, right? But then he puts compost in there, and then the water captures the water and then floods it out across his whole landscape. So his property looks like nobody else's, but he's capturing water. And I'm just gonna, again, look him up and read about it. It's pretty awesome, but hopefully we're gonna try and bring him here next fall at the Commons. So stay connected with these guys and I'll let them know and they'll put it out, but he's awesome.
So anyhow, it's just an idea of it. I've been playing with, I've been reading around about it for a long time. I knew who Martin Royds was, but long before Meagan got to go see him and I had to stay home and take care of the kids, have my job and do the ranch. But anyhow, it's just something to consider. If you can put a fence line or water line on a contour, you can build key lines using cows. So moving on. Water. So we have a variety of different types of water, right? Water is by far the most expensive and important thing to consider when you're building infrastructure on a place. You know, costs a ton of money and it's not easy to move. You know, if you put in an underground pipeline, an above ground pipeline, yeah, that's not, you can wind it back up and lay it out somewhere else. But you bury a pipeline 5-6 feet deep so it doesn't freeze in the winter. If that's not in the right place, you might as well just cap off both ends and let it become a thing for archaeologists to find thousands of years later, because it's not worth pulling it up. So you really need to think about where you're gonna put your water, and then that drives where your fence. So, you know, we utilize live water like creeks and rivers. I do not like to give livestock full access to any, I don't care if it's an irrigation ditch. I don't like to give them, they tromp it down. They're a great tool, but they can do a lot of damage if they're not managed. So water gaps are huge when you're talking about live water. We don't have any ponds, or, you know, if you go out to eastern Montana, you call them tanks. We don't have tanks or ponds, but if I did, I would not allow the cows to go into them. I mean, I would figure out some way to either siphon water out of that thing or make a tiny water gap where they can only access a little bit, because you're affecting not only the integrity of the pond, you're also affecting the health of the livestock. So there's really easy ways. I wish I could go into that, how to build a siphon in like 25 minutes to siphon out of anything. It's really super easy, couple valves, cap, Meagan says to move on. Anyhow, so next slide, please. So pipelines, I'm a huge fan of these. They're obviously expensive. If you go back to that slide.
The other one?
Yep, one with the video. Just a short video. So I have laid out miles and miles of 1.25 inch or 1.5 inch above ground pipeline by rolling it out by hand, 300 or 500 foot poles at the time.
You have sacrificed your marriage by putting your wife in the back, doing this with her hands.
Yep, so last year I was like, well, I'll use the fail bed, so I put a piece of PVC on there that would spin with things, and then, you know, but you gotta still the roll moving, otherwise it'll kink. So this last, I don't know, month, I built this thing, and it just goes on the port or the arms of a bale bed. And it mostly moves on its own. I think if you go to the next slide, I might have a couple pictures of it. And all it is like some, yeah, so all it is a couple 2x4s, a piece of PVC run through a plastic drum, and then it just clamps onto the thing, and then when I need to put a new reel on it, I lower down the arms, I take a screw gun, pull off the thing, slide another 300 to 500 feet on there, lift the bale bed up again, hook it up and go. So, I mean, you can be super creative when it comes to stuff like this. So next slide, please. That's just a different angle. So tanks, I have some examples. So like I said, we use a lot of portable tanks. Go back to that last slide. Most of them are 100 gallons to 150 gallons. I'm a big fan of, you can buy them like at Murdoch for $300 or less than that. 300-gallon tanks. Those are great in between for, you could do 500 head off of that as long as you have good recharge. And then just float valve. We have a variety of ways of hooking these up. We use irrigation pipeline, and valve openers. You'll see an example of that. I had to figure out how to siphon out of ditches and what have you, and just have a flow through tank. I really love that situation. And then, so if you go to the next slide, I think I have an example. So that's a tank that's just starting to fill. This bottom part, the bottom hole is where the water's coming in. The top hole is this, once it hits that level, it just flows right back down. And either I use it to irrigate a little small patch, or it just goes right back down into the ditch or creek or river. So you have a constant flow of water. The cows, you know, a lot of cows can come to this 300-gallon tank and drink all at once, but it keeps them out of the ditch, keeps them out of the creek. Takes a couple 100 feet, a little bit of slope to make that happen. Super easy to haul around. I got a hook on those. You can clip on with a 4-wheeler or even by hand and just drag them. They're flat bottom. That's why I like those. Empty, the wind where, you know, if you're over in Paradise Valley or Livingston, the wind will carry them a long distance. So next slide. Oh yeah. I take a lot of videos. So shoulder season. So I talk about this season of use. This next tank, you hit click play or click the button, it'll play, I think. So you can see I just threw a T in there and a little needle valve. The same thing, it's just got an overflow. I put a little pipe on it to run it down somewhere where the cows, where a little bit of water and ice isn't gonna be a problem. But when it's, you know, generally above freezing and 300 gallons isn't gonna actually freeze, but the thing that does freeze is your water line. And when you have 300 feet of 3/4 inch hose out there, you know, cracking it one little bit at a time takes a long time. So just running just a little bit of water. The only heads up on this is if you're running off somebody's well, clicking the pressure switch on and off, you might want to let them know that their pressure switch is going to die if they don't have constant pressure control around there. But anyhow, works really well for the shoulder season. I even do it on our pipelines around home, like in the spring where I want to start putting up the back fence because we're starting to get regrowth. So next slide, please. So I'm gonna, how are we doing on time? Thank you. All right, so we got another 15 minutes or so, and then we'll do questions. So this is an example of one of the tire tanks I've installed. I'm a huge fan of these barn owl cameras. They're like game cams, and they just send you pictures to your phone or your email, and you can set them up and take videos, what have you. That's where that picture came from. That's on a lease property we have across the river on the west side of Paradise Valley. And I just have it set up so at first light it takes a picture. So I know if I gotta go up there and break ice, takes a picture at noon and takes a picture right before dark, so I can go out there in the dark and chop, you know, deal with it. Came in super handy. I ran it the well. The pressure switch and the controller died on me a few weeks ago. And I was like, why is the water level going down in that tank? But there's a lot of water. So I was able to go over there, go up, switch out the pressure switch and the pump controller. So, so that's permanent tire tank. If we click to the next couple pictures. So the way this is set up is in the center, there's a PVC riser that goes all the way down below frost level. That's where the pipeline comes up, and that's also where a drain field is. And then it's just surrounded by a culvert. The only purpose of that culvert is just to protect all the plumbing. And that's all cemented into, it's like a 13-foot tire tank. I have it set up so on either side, there are little pieces of copper pipe that shoot water out in there, so just well water. If you click on the next slide.
Is it windy then?
Yeah, it's windy there. So you can kind of see the center. I did drop my phone down there and that's about 10 feet, so I didn't put that video in here. But that's kind of the start of the construction right after we poured the cement. Next slide, please. So you can see in here, and I apologize to folks online, you can't see me pointing at this. There's PVC part coming out right there, that goes down into a drain field, and that's just in the trench with some wash gravel. Tees off to a float right there on the right side of the picture, and this other tee goes over to what we can see in the next picture, I think. So that's the copper tubes coming around. Like I said, I have them spraying out on either side. The next picture. This is a little, I can't remember what they're called, but it's basically, it's designed to keep the float valve and all that open. And so when the water temperature drops enough, it'll come on and spray just a little bit of water. I've had those. I've never had a float valve in that tank. There's not a lid on it. I've never had a float valve freeze up at 40 well. So, and then the part that keeps the tank open, that's just a valve I adjust by hand. Because you can run a lot of water if you're not careful. So, and that's just that is the drain thing. And I put them on an angle and you can just twist them so you can adjust them up and down. So you don't have to try and sit there and figure out the exact height of the water. You can just play with it and slowly raise the water in the tank. So next picture. And that's again, the little, I will figure out what the name of that thing
It's a
is.
doohickey. Next
The
one.
doohickey, all right. So water, some things to think about, water quality, like I said, if you can't drink it, you probably don't want your cows drinking it. I mean, a little bit of moss, what have you, maybe I don't really want to drink it, but it's safe for the cows. Water blocks, any water tank that we have, that's a permanent tank, there is a water block around that. And all that is a fence that gives them access. And it's maybe 30 or 40 feet from the center of the tank. And that way, if all 500 cows come at once, only, 10 of them can get in there, they circle in, they circle out, and that way they don't camp at your water tank and leave all their manure and urine sitting right there. We'll get into it also if we get into the design thing. NRCS specs, shout out to the NRCS. I was a recipient of an equipped cost share, and their specs drove me nuts, right? Some of the things that they want you to do, but I will tell you, if you want something not to fail, go look at the NRCS specs, because they're fairly bomb-proof, especially when it comes to water lines. And they're right online. Next slide, please. That is kind of an example of a water block. You can see two sides of it. That cap is not dead, it's just laying there. But that's, the example of the tank in the summer or spring. I think that was taken a few days ago. Next slide, please. So one of the themes of our infrastructure is if we own it, it's gotta be portable. So that's a 3-compartment, just minimum feeders, you put salt, whatever else. And you can divide those up even more if you're got some skills. It's just on a semi-trailer tire, and then I have an eye hook on it, and you can just drag that around. You can't drag it around unless it's empty by hand. And it is a little hard to load in and out of a pickup without a bale bed, but you can do it. One person, but it's portable, so that moves every time we move the cows. And I have, and basically I just leave those at these properties and fill them up when I need them. I could go into the design flaws of the lid, etc., but Meagan says I'm not supposed to, so next slide, please. So fencing, this next slide. There are only 6 ways to lay out a pack, divide up the field, no matter how you look at it. And I tried to prove the guy, this came from Steve Kenyon, he's out of Alberta. He's been custom grazing for years and years and years. And I'm like, oh yeah, I can come up with a different way. And every version I came up with was some example of that. But this is just a good example of, how much infrastructure it takes to, break up a section. And then different options for, here you got on this lower left, for those of you online, you have basically water blocks that set up to feed 4 paddocks. This is 2 alleyways, 1 alleyway. You'd think this is how you would set up a center pivot. It's not. Then portals will strip grazing water truck method if you wanted to haul cows, water your cows every single day. So, yeah, I'll share the slideshow with you guys so you can take a look at that, but that is any way you set up fence, it's gonna end up looking like that if you divide it with pasture. Maybe not that symmetrical and cool looking, but it will be some version of that. So, next one, please. Exterior fence, obviously here in Montana, you gotta fence your cows off the highway. That's super important. Most neighbors don't enjoy having your cows on their place or your sheep, although Malloy did have a lease where they really enjoyed when her
They
sheep
did,
got out.
yeah. They were retired, kept them busy.
Yeah. But you know, exterior fence, whatever you need to use, like I said, I would never use barbed wire again. I just use high tensile wire and electric 5 wire. It's a heck of a lot cheaper, it's easier to build, lasts a lot longer, it's more wildlife friendly. Temporary fence, and poly wire, you know, we'll get into it a little bit, but it pays to buy good stuff. Like if you're gonna use reels, buy good reels. If you're gonna buy poly wire, spend good money on the poly wire because it'll last a lot longer. Next one, and it'll carry more current. So here's some examples of just things that we use. I don't know what kind of reel that is, O'Brien or Terragate or something like that, but they're geared reels. So every time you turn the handle once, it pulls up 3 times as much twine or braided poly wire. That's a McBride reel stand. It's actually set up backwards. That brace should be going the way the wire's going. Those are super handy. They're cheap. You can build them by yourself, but it just helps you, especially when you're trying to figure out where you want to put your infrastructure. If you're building a lot of poly wire fence or temporary fence, you know, that is a handy way to just put an end post in. The next one. That's an example that there's the sheep yesterday. Some of the boys using lambs. She sets them up with 3 wires initially when she lets them out, when there's new lambs, and then she can train them down to 2 wires. So that's just a power post that you can get from powerflex.com or whatever. They're pretty proud of those, but I've looked at them and I guarantee I can't build them for that. But they're just a slide hammer that slides down into the ground, and she uses that to hang 3 different reels on for her sheep. Next one. That's an example of, you know, a portable energizer. If I have the ability to put a permanent energizer in that's actually plugged into a wall somewhere, I would. But as you're moving around, having something that's portable is nice. There's all sorts of companies out there that make solar energizers and they are all crap. I'm sorry, they're expensive and they break. You can go on to Amazon, buy a little solar panel, 30-watt solar panel. Basically buy a 10 watts per joule to your energizer. Buy a energizer, that's only 1,000 watt or 1,000 joule watt or 1 joule energizer. A little Gorilla cart, some angle iron, and you can build your own energizer for $500-600 bucks. But any part of it that breaks, you can replace. So, and you can also hook it onto a 4-wheeler and drag it around. Next one. Oh, I want to touch on this in water. It's a super easy way, if you have irrigation water, to tap into an irrigation water line, is just use a riser. You can design a little cap that slides in there. And then we just use those plastic risers that you just plug a hose into. And so that can just move around. So if you have, again, it depends on the season of use, etc. But that's one of the tools that we use to water our livestock. Next one. Corrals and handling facilities. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to take a picture of our basically our setup, which is not a really cool like tow behind corral system with wheels that you can spread out. I'd love to have one of those things, but it's basically it's 3 panels, 12-foot panels by 2 12-foot panels, so it's a 36 by 24. And then off of that, there's a mud box that's 20 feet by 12 feet. And I can either use that to load a portable chute, or I can use it to load a trailer through the small door, or I can use it to load a trailer through the alleyway. And I've loaded, most of our places don't have any permanent facilities to load out of, and I've loaded hundreds of cows into stock trailers that way. The other thing about that is it makes you good a stock handler, because it's not sturdy enough to handle much pressure. So, yeah, I should provide a picture for that as well. But yeah, you can get pretty creative cows that respect electric fence. You can run them, you know, you put 20 cows in that 24 by 36 pen at a time and just sort off 10 or 12 or however many your stock trailer fits and just load them out. Yeah, so you don't have to be terribly fancy with that. So next slide, please. So just I put overhead ratio in here. Which basically I consider, if you're leasing ground, I consider your overheads, there's what you pay for the lease, and what you pay for labor. So that really drives your infrastructure development. So it makes more sense to me to spend a little bit of money up front to put in permanent infrastructure that is going to save me hours and hours of labor every single day. So that's just something to consider. It's a lot of money to put out to build miles and miles of electric permanent fence and put in pipeline. But if you have to pay somebody $25 to $30 an hour to do it, and you got to think about, this is the part I'm not very good at, is I don't think about paying myself to do it. I'm subsidizing my business with my own labor, but if I have to pay somebody else, which occasionally Meagan and I are both gone and somebody's got to do it. So I got to pay a decent amount of money. So keep that in mind. When we're structuring our leases, the land and labor, we don't ever pay over 40% of what we could gross off of that. That's not what we're actually making profit wise, but if I could generate $10,000, I can't pay more than $4,000 in my lease payment and what I'm paying for labor for that period of time. So, and then cash flow, that kind of goes into the same conversation as, you know, how are you generating money? You know, a lot of this infrastructure, if you do it piecemeal, makes sense because you only have so much money to invest in doing that. But the more you can invest up front, the quicker it's going to return for you. Next one. So nice to have, stock trailer, portable squeeze corral, squeeze chute. Like I said, I'd love to have one of those really cool aero equipped things. Meagan says I keep on needing to hurry. But you can get by with a few panels. A bale bed, a truck with a bale bed is super nice to have, especially if you're having to feed cows somewhere else, but you can get by without it. ATV is awful nice. Next one. Side by side, apparently have ATV on there. Steve Kenyon up in Alberta, big fan of geo trackers and Suzuki Samurais. You can get them for like $5,000 you can find them. They're better than a side by side and a lot less money. Portable wind brakes are super nice if you don't have trees. So next one. So need to have. Don't necessarily need to have legs, but you gotta have the will to get around. Your mind, I mean, really, it comes down to a mindset when it comes to this stuff. You need to have a plan to begin with, because you can waste a lot of money and a lot of time with all this infrastructure. So next slide, please. Adaptability, just going with the flow. Sometimes what you think will work doesn't work, and being able to adjust. Should probably say humility, the ability to ask other people that have experience doing things like this. MacGyverism. So next slide. MacGyver. The old MacGyver, not new MacGyver. Next slide, please. And then, you know, if you're gonna be using polywire for your infrastructure, you gotta have good reels, you have to have good posts, high quality energizer, and the lifesaver, unless you like getting shocked, is a remote. Some of our energizers are actually set off of a remote where I can turn on and off, so I can work with that fence or a fence tester.
And we have a great list if you guys want, just of what we're buying right now, and
Yeah.
we're more than willing to share that, because we tested everything out there, so we're just, let us know, we'll send it to you, Sydney, and you can share it with people.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
So I'd like to take this opportunity, I mean, I do have a potential exercise or something for you guys to think about, but just for any questions or thoughts, that you guys might have. I know Christian's done a lot of bunch of this. I don't know a lot of the rest of you folks in the room. Anything else you're interested in that I didn't touch on or? Yeah,
Pete, so those water tanks,
yep.
you don't have I mean, if you're out where there's no electricity and is there, how do you get that water off of a creek or something like that and into a tank?
If you don't have gravity, you could certainly use something like a trash pump if you had a big enough tank, but solar pumps.
And so are you talking that you would use that trash pump and just fill it up once a day?
Yep, or so maybe several times a day if I could get to a water source like that. The other thing is if you can't gravity flow the water to begin with, putting in a solar pump. And there's a lot of people around here that'll work with those sort of solar pumps. I can give you some names on that. You know, pumping your water uphill, putting it in a storage tank and letting gravity feed it for yourself. You know, that way it's pumping water, filling a tank during the day while you have the sunshine. And then your tank is on a float valve, hopefully that doesn't break. And, you know, it'll drain off that tank at night and keep it open, or keep it full. That's another option. I'm sure there's other ones I haven't thought about. But yeah, solar's super cool. You know, it looks like you have a question, so I'm just
I'm
gonna
just
stare at
curious.
you.
It seems like you probably don't have a ton of success getting your landlords to do permanent infrastructure. Is it more of a preference that you'd rather have it?
I have had some pretty good success. And I think it's partially, the landowners that we're working with. You gotta think that we're in Paradise Valley. So what they paid for the property that they were leasing from them is, you know, $10,000 to put in a tire tank is not the end of the world. But, you know, again, it comes back down to values and what they want. It's like, all right, I know this is a lot of money to ask you to put out, but unless you're gonna give me a 10 or 20-year lease, I can't afford to put $10,000 in. But if you want me to be able to manage my livestock better and, you know, have a better impact on your land, if I could get one tank right here, you know, if you can get somebody to put the water line in and set the tire tank, because I can't do that by hand, you know,
Yeah.
I'll come in, I'll pour the cement, I'll plumb it, I'll take care of it. That's the kind of things that I use to try and sell landowners on that.
Your discussions lead to, you know, if I can establish a longer term lease agreement.
Yeah.
It'd be a lot easier to do.
Yep, especially if it's my capital going after that, I'm gonna need that. And if I'm gonna put a ton of fence in, even if it's fence that I can take down, you know. I think at one lease, it took us, we put in like 5 miles of fence in about 4 days,
Yeah.
but it was a lot of work, you know, and tens of thousands of dollars, yeah.
Plus, as a landowner, if somebody's gonna do the work and I get a tax deduction, I'm all about that.
Yeah,
So a lot of landowners.
Yeah.
Are like, well, hard to.
no, that was a good point.
How much time do you spend moving the cows and like every day?
In the summer, it gets a little bit more intense because we do break them up a little bit. We have our finishing beef and then we have our cow calf herd plus our yearlings. We put them all together. So there's at least 2 herds, depending on the objective. Like at the Jordan Ranch right now, I had the cows there all winter, grass is growing up right now. I'm not gonna have them back there until next spring, but I would like to graze it likely. So I'll probably have a custom herd that I gotta move. So in the summer, quite a bit, like 4 or 5 hours a day moving the cows with traveling. In the winter, when they're all combined into one herd, and I keep. People will be like, oh my God, I can't believe you do this. I keep my bulls in with my cows and so much. We don't calve until May. If the bull's breeding something at that point, they're not gonna have a calf. You know, they're gonna go out as an open anyhow. So I run my bulls, I run our horses. If Malloy had her choice, she'd run her sheep in the same herd. Don't have a fence for that. But yeah, so in the winter, half an hour to 45 minutes a day. I basically take down one, we strip graze away from a permanent tank. We take down one fence, let the cows have a day's worth of feed. Leapfrog that fence ahead, so if they break through the next fence, there's at least another fence for them to try to break through. So yeah, 45 minutes. No, if it's not, Jordan Ranch is home for us, so if it's not, you know, whatever it takes me to drive across the valley, 20 minutes plus that, so an hour. Not a bad way to go. It's a nice thing to have to do every day. Does
Are you-
kind of suck when it's cold.
Yeah, are you feeding hay in the winter?
This year I fed less than half a ton per animal unit. So, but yeah, like when it got super cold, I'll feed hay, just the cows do better. But as soon as I can go back to grading, I'll go back to grading. Yeah. Christian?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, what kind of densities do you do with the daily moves and like the irrigated ground?
See. 100 standard animal units per maybe an acre per day, depending on the stage of the growth and what the objective is, so. What's that, 100,000
Yeah,
per acre
per day.
per day, yeah. So, and I break everything to standard animal units, stuff you just have, it's easier.
Do you have a preferred like paddock system? You showed all the different options up there.
The pipeline method would be probably if I had the money to do it. Would be my ideal, just because it's the lowest amount of labor. And it's also the evenest, most even distribution of animal impact and nutrients. But if it wasn't that, it would be the 2 alleyway system. I don't have any of them set up that way, because I've been able to structure it differently, but yeah, that would be my favorite. I like pipeline over live water. Good question. Any others? Mike?
So what's the magic height to keep the cows and the calves in?
Ooh, 32 inches.
32 inches.
Yes, and Meagan hates me when I tell us, but the way I came up with that
That's
happens
not
to be,
fair.
it happens to be my instinct.
So I have the duck. I mean, I gotta go under, but he's like.
So 32 inches, I can step right over. The calves, you know, generally when they're little, they'll start going under it, but when they're big enough to get shocked once, then they think that thing is magical. And 32 inches, you know, cow can easily jump that, but once you train them, and if you are taking in other people's cow, that helps to have a corral to have them receive in and put the electric fence somewhere by the water, so they're gonna bump into it and realize that it's electrified. But yeah, 32 inches works really well. That's where I put all my permanent fences too. Somewhere in that range, 30 to 36.
Do you see virtual fencing on the horizon for you guys?
No,
No?
not. I don't think the technology's out there yet. My sister's trying it out this year, but east of Billings there. So I'm super excited to hear from her. I know another landowner that the people that are gonna be running cows there. I think it'd be awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, especially for large rain situations, but from what I've heard so far is they haven't figured out the collars to make them terribly humane, not so much from the shocking standpoint, but from the cow carrying it standpoint.
Yeah.
But that's just with the fence company. I don't know who else is out there, but yeah, I keep an eye on it.
Yeah, it seems like it could be useful in your guys' situation potentially. but-
Yeah, no, it's super funny because I have a friend that was in college in MSU at the same time I was, which is like almost 30 years ago.
Mhm.
And he was working on that technology way back then. And it's finally kind of starting to come to fruition. He's a lot smarter now. So, any other questions?
I'm curious if you have time. You started it on why a cow's rumen dictates how frequently you'll move cattle in a way.
Yeah.
Can you address that a little bit?
Sure. Bacteria in the rumen turn over every like 4 to 7 days. If you keep that cow, like in 3 days, right, cow's gonna go out, they're gonna eat best grass, they're gonna cruise across the paddock. Theoretically, they will actually, you watch them, they'll eat all the best. And the next day, there's a little bit left, and they're gonna eat that, and that's, third day, it's gonna be, get down to lower quality. This is assuming you don't give them a huge area. And assuming you don't let them back graze. So for those 3 days, that that bug population in the rumen's gonna stay fairly steady to deal with that forage. After day 4 or 5, you know, especially if you put past 7, the gut biology is gonna start turning over to deal with whatever forage they're on. So if it's poor quality forage, you know, it'll develop bugs that deal with poor quality forage. Well, if their gut bacteria or biology is turned over and then you put them on good forage, you just wasted a ton of gain in calories because now that bacteria cannot deal with that. So it's going all out the back end without pulling the nutrients off. So if you can keep them on a relatively level plane of nutrition, even a declining plane of nutrition, they're gonna do a lot better. A good example of that, sorry, keep going. Like in the winter, we go on stockpile. You know, November 1st, that stockpile is pretty good quality. February 28th is starting to really decline. March, you know, we're starting to get some green grass in there, but they're on a decline, an even plane of declining nutrition, and they'll maintain body condition after that, because their gut bacteria is slowly adjusting to the lower quality food. So we can get by without supplementing. So that's why people supplement on range, right? Is to feed the gut bacteria so they can deal with the poor grass quality. So that's why. Yeah. All right, go ahead.
I got one more.
Yeah.
I got lots, but
No,
I'm
that's-
gonna ask one right now. So, Peter, you have read about this, like, take half, leave half,
Mhm.
or, I mean, is that something that you're looking at doing with this type of method, or how do you, when you get out there and you look and you say, oh, this is just right, or this is too long, or no, I can keep it here an extra day, what are you looking at? What do you?
That's a really good question. So I'm looking at the plant recovery versus when I know I'm coming back. So I'll give you an example. We have a lease of Deep Creek. By the time we go up there, typically the grass is done growing. And so I can get away with putting a tank up high. I still try to leave quite a bit of grass, but if they take it down a little bit more, it's not a huge deal because I'm not gonna come back until that plant's had a chance to go through winter, spring, you know, as long as I'm leaving enough for it to go into winter without killing off that plant. So sometimes we'll graze that down a little bit shorter. It just depends on when we're coming back. Like early in the spring, I really try to leave more like 2/3 or more. Because you knock that plant back enough early in the spring, then it's going back with reserves to recover versus if I leave quite a bit of leaf material, I can go over a paddock really for property really quickly. And, you know, it'll be recovered in 20 or 30 days. But it'll recover a lot faster if I leave.
In early spring is when?
To me, anytime between when the grass starts greening up and probably mid-June.
Mid-June.
It, you know, it depends on context. I mean, some parts of Montana green up a lot quicker and have a lot quicker growth, but in our area, you know, I kind of look at it as, you know, the real flush of grass is generally between June 1st and the 4th of July. That's really when we grow most of our grass, even on irrigated ground. That's your 2 to 3 tons an acre on hay ground kind of ground. So, yeah, generally, but it all depends on when, again, you go back to that first principle of grazing, it really is driven by rest. And so that's gonna drive your decisions. And I know nobody ever gives a straight answer to that question. I apologize, but it really,
Well, I'm glad you you weren't the first one.
yeah, no, I definitely weren't, but, you know, as a general rule, that's a great place to start. You're not gonna go wrong by leaving at least half. But if you look at half of a plant, you know, it's not half of the height. Generally, it's a lot less than half. You graze down a lot less than half of the height, just depending on the plant. Because most of the biomass is in the bottom. What else?
When you're rotating that often, are you taking care of the parasite control too?
I'd assume so. We haven't poured or wormed our cows for almost 10 years now, and we very rarely have an issue. I mean. You think of a cow that was grossly wormy or even really wormy? No. Yeah, I mean, we're moving them so often that by the time we're coming back to it. I don't think any parasites are out there that came out of at least that same cow herd. There might be something in the soil. But yeah, it helps a lot.
You talked about, the boundary fencing, you like the high tensile versus the barbed wire. And after, listening to you talk a little bit about, I mean, why would anybody continue to put in barbed wire fence? What are the advantages or disadvantages to that?
I think it's lack of experience with electric fence. A properly installed electric fence is not gonna have very many shorts, short of broken wire. So I think a lot of it's just perception. It's like, well, that's smooth. It's not even gonna hurt me.
Yeah.
With 5 wires of high tensile, unless you have really hungry cows, which isn't, the issue then isn't your fence, it's the cows, your management. Even with 5 strands of high tensile, if it's old, no electricity, it's still gonna hold a cow that is reasonable.
Right.
You can work with it with your hands.
Yeah.
I mean, the amount of scars across my body from working with barbed wire over my lifetime are amazing, but I really think it's why do people rotate their cows and some people don't? It's like, well, that's not, barbed wire is what works.
I think for us too, with a lot of the landowners, they wanna see a lot of the elk and the deer come through, so
Very wildlife.
it's an
friendly.
easy, it's an easy sell.
Well, and if our cows aren't there in the winter and the elk are coming through, which hopefully our cows aren't where the elk are coming through, because, especially if I'm feeding hay. But that high tensile wire, your posts are spaced far apart, you can stretch that wire, take 4 strands or 3 strands and put it down to this, and then the elk can just run right through, and then you don't have to repair your fence.
Right.
I mean, to me, it's kind of a no brainer, and just, you look at the cost of a spool of barbed wire for a 3/4 mile spool, about $100 now. A 4,000 foot spool of high tensile wire is maybe 150. 1,340 feet versus 4,000 feet for $50 more. Yeah, just economically it makes more sense. I'm a cheap bugger.
With electric fence, have you guys had any trouble with the law cows out, sheep in fencing?
No. Yeah. The only problem we've ever had with electric fence is when I've tried to put it on a barbed wire fence. And the deer go through it and they spin a piece of barbed wire around it and create a dead short.
Oh, I mean the law where technically you have to fence cows out
Right.
and sheep in.
No.
Okay.
No, even
So
though
all the
they're,
neighbors down there are like pretty for it and.
yeah, no, even our neighbors across the road that aren't feeding their cows, they don't bother our fence. So definitely keeping them out. Sheep in. Different.
Sheep.
Sheep for sheep. Sheep are like goats, they can fit their thought through it, they can get through it. But we'll always train your sheep, like I said. She calls ruthlessly too. If you ever want somebody to really improve your genetics, hire our daughter, because she does not care. I mean, she does care, but she's like, that was my bum lamb, she didn't have twins, she's going down.
Yeah.
So, anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm also curious about, so you hit on short-term lease versus a long-term lease, right? And having that conversation with landowners.
yep.
From your perspective as an operator, what is your, and maybe it's a deal breaker for you, but what is your mindset when you're dealing with a landowner that has trepidation of going into a long-term lease? Just because, they're an absentee owner and there's some unknown and they're not sure what they're getting themselves into.
Yep.
So they're like, look, I'll let you graze on here, but I want to do a 1-year deal.
Yep.
From your perspective, does that handcuff you quite a bit as as it relates to, you working the land? And
Yeah.
is that something you'd even take on there?
Not usually, okay, it depends on how direct, right now, house prices, they are probably, but. No, and it really comes down to, it's like, well. And what I sell them on is, or what we sell them on, Meagan's the better salesperson, I just talk about infrastructure, but, is we can manage, if you're willing to go, let's say, 3 to 5 years, to at least let us have enough of a carrot to start investing some of our time and money into managing your place, then you're gonna be a lot happier with the management. If you want your place to look just like the neighbors, where people just come drop their cows off, to check the cows every once in a while, or their sheep, whatever, I just use cows. Then yeah, 1 year deal's fine, but you're not gonna see much management, and it's not trying to be flippant about that, no, it's like, hey. We don't pay a lot for leases, and the reason we don't is because we try to sell people on our management. And we've met with some pretty big landowners, that have, you know, really no reason to make any money off of their place. And when you talk about numbers of like, if we're going to do it this way, this, or if somebody was going to do it this way, this is the maximum amount they could pay. You're like, what? We've been getting $35 a pair a month. I'm like, yeah, but look at your land.
And then we also say, well, then you should probably continue with that then.
Yeah,
Because.
if you're happy with that situation, but you know, it's a. And I don't mean to sound like just because you have enough money to own a piece of property means that you should be able to give somebody something for free, but. If you're getting something in return, whether it's money or management, I mean, those are two-part pieces of the same puzzle.
Yeah.
So that's what we try to sell people on.
Well, we had just an awesome opportunity to sit down at the dinner table with one of our folks that we lease for, and I was like, well, what do you like, you know, about what you're seeing? And well, oh my gosh, the Huns have come back, and I can't believe the amount of elk that have come through here, and blah, 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 blah. And then we're like, let's talk about how much labor we're spending here, because we love these people, but
Oh, yeah.
we got real about what we were putting in and getting out of it, and they were really surprised. Well, I didn't know you were spending that much money on that. I didn't know, you know, it's like we try to teach them as much as we can about these things and what we're doing and what agriculture is doing for their land and why it's important. So we're, you know, still at the table about what we're gonna pay, but yeah, we just try to think more like sheep people, more like goat people. We're mitigating fire, we're bringing back an ecosystem. We're here to work for you. You have 100 landscapers that are coming on your place. And so how can we make this so it's fair?
Yeah, no, there are, because sometimes you think, oh, this would be a great deal, and then you actually get into it, and you're like, holy cow, I had no idea that moving these 3 wheel lines would take an unskilled person 4 hours in the morning and 4 hours at night, so they're spending their entire day moving those wheel lines. So, yeah, I mean, in that situation, we talk to landowners like, okay, if you want us to stay, then we need to change some of this irrigation to be successful.
Yeah.
Couldn't convince them to buy $100,000 pivot, but I don't blame them. I mean, you know, some of that stuff's kind of unreasonable, but meeting somewhere in the middle. We graze a lot on pivots. We have 4 of them that we graze on. Those are kind of our winter ground, you know, where we stockpile because we have the ability to control the precipitation and their lowest labor. And I can't believe I didn't even bring an example of that, so I'll put one out there. Are you taking emails for this so we can send out anything?
I'm gonna sign in at the front. I think I have most everyone's emails, but
Okay.
if I don't, feel free to sign that.
Let's see, the last slide should be our contact information. That's another slide next after that one. So email, cell phones, feel free to reach out. If you have somebody who's looking for help with infrastructure, that's something that I'm starting to slowly phase myself into. As far as helping people, for compensation. To be blunt, but yeah, it's really a passion of mine. Of like, I want people to be successful. I want you know, I'd love to graze the entire Paradise Valley, with everybody's cows working together, and do it in a way that is maximal sustainable profit for everybody. That's probably not gonna happen in my lifetime or my kid's lifetime, but I do wanna spread like what we're doing, not necessarily exactly how we're doing it, but the same principles, et cetera. So if I can work with landowners or, you know, grazers, to help them be successful, that's something that I find very satisfying. I just gotta find time for it. So anyhow, take down that if you're interested. If you just have questions, shoot us an email. Give me a call, shoot me, probably a text works better. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Is it that phone back that you dropped in or? That's what you-
He did.
Yeah, I did. That's where the MacGyverism came.
Oh, okay.
It's funny, I got a video. I'd run home and get a tool called a combi, it's like a hoe. And then I had to go find a piece of old junk pipe and some Gorilla Tape. And my daughter taking video of me and my alarm is going off on my phone to go pick up my son, which I was not doing. So I was able to fish it out, but yeah, I've gotten a lot better about putting it in my back pocket when I'm working on water tanks or places where it could fall.
Oh, yeah, I know Kelsey's dad uses that. She's down in East Colorado. And
Yeah.
got a bright pink phone case, right there.
Yeah.
I want to bounce
Yellow.
off the four-wheeler.
Yeah,
Okay.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
I've lost my phone a lot.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank you guys.
Hey, Pete,
Yeah,
I thought you were gonna touch on, grazing and right there, there is.
Oh,
yeah. No, that's,
Jump up there in front. row.
Okay, yeah. So,
You guys.
you know, if you think about how in riparian areas evolved, like if we all eliminated people and what have you, and we went back a couple hundred years ago. I mean, animals were going through the riparian area, so the vegetation in there, the trees, et cetera, they're adapted to an occasional disturbance. What they're not adapted to is a constant presence of livestock or wildlife. So there's very few situations where targeted grazing in that riparian area isn't a good idea. And when I'm talking about targeted, I'm talking like maybe 12 hours, you know, just let them run through there, eat down the vegetation and move on. You know, they're gonna knock down some of the banks where they're cutting and eroding. But they're also gonna stimulate the ground and things like, especially aspen, you know, unless you're gonna burn it. In order to get that aspen to regenerate, you gotta get the disturbance. And so we've had really good luck in the areas, and not just on the Jordan Ranch, but in places where we had little aspen stands, being able to run those cows through there, but not let them be there constantly. We're starting to see sprouts. So I think that being thoughtful about it and, you know, maybe deferring every couple of years and just running them through there isn't gonna do any harm. And places like where you have a lot of weed disturbance and stuff like that, you know, if you can get that vegetation that you want to grow, you know, cows definitely are gonna help that, as long as they're only there for a short period of time. Does that answer your question, or is it pretty much the same answer you got from everybody else?
Pretty loose.
So when you're saying run through for 12 hours, are you talking just like in a specific area where, what about the meadows and that sort of thing, that it might be down in the riparian area that's,
You know, more like,
you know,
like wetland, like,
well, not necessarily wetlands, but you know, it's just not a solid, you know, bunch of aspen or cottonwood
Yep.
or whatever. I mean, there's meadows and there's brush and there's willows and there's, you know,
yep,
I mean, it's a mosaic. And so, you know, trying to figure out, okay, how do I get some stimulation down here and get some of this grass eaten and.
Yep.
And striking that balance there and.
I would pick an area that you're trying to target, you know. when I'm thinking like riparian, I'm thinking like the classic people put their fence line somewhere above the flood line where you're not generally marshy or anything like that. But, you know, pick an area that you wanna target. And say 100 hens is always the example I go back to because it's easy math. It's like, okay, I look at this and like, I think that'll feed 100 cows pretty easily in a day. Throw them in that area for a day and then get them out. And as you do that, I mean, that's why I like daily moves as well, because it's instantaneous, mostly instantaneous feedback. It's like, whoa, that was enough ground, or that was too much ground, or, but, you know, do that, test an area. I don't want to say, so what if you screw that area up, or it looks kind of like a disaster, if you're not coming back for another year, it's gonna heal.
And that's just where you add more rest. I mean,
Yeah.
if you make a mistake, you just add in that rest and then it'll come back, yeah.
Yeah, Meagan loves, like,
I screwed up.
she'll come back, and this isn't specific to riparian areas, but she'll come back after moving these cows like. It doesn't look very good. And I'm like, it doesn't matter, we're not coming back to that, we might not come back to that this year, and half the areas she screws up. Or
They
she
actually look the best.
screws up, looks the best, cause it causes something else to kind of, like, generally alfalfa legumes, when you graze your grass down really short, will pop up as long as you get the rest. But something like a riparian area or next to, you know, something that you want to mostly exclude the livestock from, just pick an area and try it out in a couple different spots and see what happens. And if that in a year doesn't look good to you, then try something different. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, maybe if there are any other specific questions, we could just wait a moment. And yeah, thank you all so much for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, if you're interested in any other conservation district programs or swag, we have things on this back table here. So, yeah.
And I was gonna say, as the winners of the Aldo Leopold Conservation Award, we have a tour on July 6th.
Yep.
So we're gonna have buses, we're gonna go to, I think, 4 different leases. Lots of activities planned, got a soil trench, got someone in the soil trench showing the soil profile. Going maybe through some water infiltration, so things you've probably done before, but you'll at least get to see that on our leases and in our non-irrigated and irrigated grazing stuff.
How do we get notified about something like that?
Probably through these guys
Okay.
would be the best, yeah, yeah,
Great.
Yeah.
come in,
More the merrier.
yeah. Let's show Stacy, we can pull out that bus, Stacy Martin, Stacy, climb up the bus, and like.
That's great.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. I know, I've been.
I was all-
Oh, I didn't see that. I gotta update that. I didn't think it would get much space. Yeah.